I began jogging at night about a year ago, primarily because there's less car and bike traffic to deal with, and the cooler evening air is preferable to the heat of the day. I usually stick to well-lit streets in my neighborhood, but one night, I decided to explore a new route through a part of town I wasn't too familiar with. It was a clear and beautiful night, and after finishing my regular 5-mile run, I felt good enough to keep going. I entered an area with fewer streetlights, and the roads were nearly empty. Occasionally, a car passed by, but the only consistent sound was my shoes hitting the pavement. As I turned down a street I hadn't been on before, I noticed the houses were older, and the yards were somewhat neglected. I figured I'd make a quick loop through the neighborhood, and then head home. After running for a few blocks, I noticed a man walking on the other side of the street. A few moments later, I realized he had crossed over to my side and was now jogging behind me. This seemed odd because he had been walking earlier, and now it felt like he was deliberately following me. Every time I sped up, he matched my pace, and it began to make me feel uneasy. Wanting to test if he was actually following me, I slowed down slightly, and as I expected, he did the same. When I picked up my pace again, he mirrored me once more. He stayed far enough behind that I couldn't make out his face clearly, but he was dressed in dark clothes, and his movements were calm and deliberate. Although I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, I couldn't shake the discomfort I felt. I approached a better lit street, hoping to feel safer, but when I glanced back, I saw that the man had also turned onto this street. He was still keeping his distance, but was clearly following me. I didn't want to confront him or make it obvious that I was scared, so I decided to head toward a more populated area, hoping to lose him in the crowd. I took a few more turns, running faster than usual, but every time I looked back, the man was still there, staying in the shadows, making it difficult for me to get a proper look at him. Finally, I saw a group of people gathered outside a bar, talking and laughing. I made my way toward them, and as I approached, I took one last look behind me. The man had stopped at the edge of the light, just standing there and watching. I sprinted the last stretch to the bar, trying to catch my breath. When I looked back again, the man had turned and walked away into the darkness. I stayed at the bar for a while, grabbing some water and giving myself time to calm down. After enough time had passed and I felt it was safe, I jogged back home, this time sticking to well-lit streets and staying close to houses. Fortunately, I didn't see the man again. After that night, I made sure to only jog in areas I knew well and felt safe in. I've been jogging through my neighborhood for years, mostly sticking to familiar routes. One evening, it was cool and quiet, perfect weather for a run. I took my usual path down a street where the houses are older and the streetlights are spaced far apart. There's one house on that route that's been abandoned for as long as I can remember. The yard is overgrown, the paint is peeling, and the windows are boarded up. I once asked my parents why it had been vacant for so long, and they told me that someone had died tragically inside, and no one wanted to buy it. So it was just left to decay. That night, as I passed the abandoned house, I noticed something odd. The front door, which was always securely boarded up, was slightly open. The boards looked loose, as though someone had forced their way inside. I slowed down to get a better look and saw a faint flickering light from within. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the flicker was too consistent. It looked like a candle or a small lamp, moving as if someone was carrying it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the house cautiously. Through the gap in the door, I could make out shadows moving inside. It was difficult to see clearly, but there were definitely two figures. At first, I thought it might be kids exploring the old place, but something didn't feel right. The strong smell of cigar smoke drifted out, and I wondered why someone would use candles instead of flashlights. More candles had been lit, and now I could make out the shadowy figures of a group of people inside. One person sat in a chair, gesturing animatedly, as though speaking passionately. I could hear voices, but they were too muffled to understand. Just then, one of the boards I had been leaning against snapped loudly. The person in the chair stopped, turned toward the door, and quickly blew out the candles. Realizing I had been discovered, I felt a surge of fear and took off running, not stopping until I reached my own street. When I got home, I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't even sure what I would say. The next day, as I drove past the house on my way to work, the door was closed again and the boards had been resecured as if nothing had happened. Since that night, I've always been curious whenever I jog past that house, but I haven't seen anything unusual again. I like going on jogs to stay in shape, and even when I'm on vacation, I usually find a way to get a run in. I stayed at my cabin for a few days on a weekend in September, and the cabin was situated on a dirt road that wound through a dense forest. It was peaceful there, which is exactly what I was looking for. The sun was setting as I set out for my jog, and the light was starting to fade. I was used to running on these roads, so the diminishing light didn't bother me. As I ran, the road became darker, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I kept my pace steady, trying to clear my mind. There's something about running alone in the woods that makes you acutely aware of your surroundings. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig makes you wonder if an animal is out there. Halfway through my run, an old pickup truck passed me by going the other way. Normally, I didn't see any cars out there, but there were other cabins nearby. I never really tried to stop by or get to know any of the other owners of the cabins on the road, but I figured that they were pretty normal people. I finished the loop I was jogging, and as I arrived, I turned up the driveway toward my cabin. The old pickup truck drove past me again, and the man inside gave me a friendly wave. I didn't think much of it at the time, as I didn't know anybody who lived in the neighboring cabins. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was dark. I let myself in, went through my usual routine of showering and preparing dinner, and then I settled down on the couch with a book. Later that night, close to 10 p.m., once it had gotten fully dark, I heard the sound of a car engine far away, but it sounded closer to my cabin than it should have, like they had gone up the driveway a little bit. I then heard heavy footsteps on the porch, and the unmistakable sound of somebody trying to turn the doorknob. My heart started pounding in my chest. I called the police, but my cabin was in the middle of nowhere, so I was told it would be a little while before they arrived. I knew I had to protect myself if it came to that, so I grabbed a heavy flashlight and a broom. Not exactly ideal weapons, but it was all that I had. Whoever was outside began pounding on the door. It sounded like they were really trying to force their way in. After a while, the banging stopped, and I could hear the intruder's footsteps moving quickly, circling the cabin, looking for another entrance, I presumed. Thankfully, all the windows were on the second level, and out of reach of the intruder, unless they had a ladder. Eventually, I heard a car engine start and the intruder drive away. When the police arrived, I didn't have much to tell them besides earlier when I was on my jog. The man in the old pickup truck had driven by me twice. The officer notified me that he had actually driven by the truck on the way to the cabin, and he might have his license plate on camera. Nothing eventful happened the rest of the nights that I was staying in the cabin, and I never heard back from the police department either. I guess they didn't catch a license plate, or it wasn't worth investigating, since it was just a hunch based on a truck I had seen earlier that night while jogging. When I decided to take a weekend vacation at a rural Airbnb, I was hoping for some peace and quiet. The listing had promised beautiful scenery and a cozy place to stay on a working farm. I'm not one for the farm life, but the idea of waking up to the sound of birds and getting some fresh air sounded perfect. On the second morning of my stay, I woke up early. I've been trying to get back into a jogging routine, so I thought this would be the perfect place to do it. I got dressed, laced up my sneakers, and headed out the front door. The farmhouse was surrounded by a large open field with a few scattered barns. I started jogging along a dirt path that seemed to wind around the edge of the property. It was peaceful, and I found myself settling into a comfortable rhythm. After about a mile, I noticed a small, overgrown path leading off into the woods. I wasn't planning to go that way, but something about it piqued my curiosity. I decided to see where it went, and I turned off the main path to follow the narrower trail. It was less maintained, with branches reaching out and the ground uneven beneath my feet. This path led me deeper into the woods, and soon I could no longer see the farmhouse or the fields. I was still enjoying the jog until I came upon a clearing. At first, it looked like just another open space in the woods. But then I saw something odd. In the middle of the clearing was an old, broken-down structure. It looked like a shed or a small cabin, but it was partially collapsed and covered in thick vines. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the windows were either boarded up or shattered. I slowed to a walk and approached the building. Peering through one of the broken windows, I could see a dusty interior with old furniture covered in cobwebs. There was a rusted metal shelf with what looked like old jars and cans, but nothing that really caught my eye. I decided to take a few pictures with my phone. I wanted to show them to the Airbnb host later and ask about the building, just out of curiosity. Later that day, I mentioned the weird structure to the host when I saw them in the kitchen. Their reaction was immediate and unsettling. They went pale and said, "Oh, you found that place? You shouldn't go near it." When I asked why, they avoided eye contact and said that it wasn't safe and had been abandoned for years. Later that evening, as I reviewed the photos on my phone, I noticed something disturbing. In one of the pictures of the inside of the building, there was a figure, just a shadowy outline, standing in the corner of the room. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or a result of poor photo quality, but the figure looked too defined to be a mere glitch. The next Monday, after returning from my weekend trip, I couldn't stop thinking about the building and my photos of the place. When I got home from work, I did a quick search online to see if I could find any information on the property. To my surprise, I found an old news article from decades ago. It was about a family that lived on the farm, but they had mysteriously disappeared. There were no leads or explanations, just an empty farmhouse and an investigation that had gone cold. I got chills just sitting in my house as I read the article about what I had stumbled across on my jog unknowingly. It was a cool fall morning when I decided to go for a jog. I had just moved to a new city and was trying to get into a routine. The neighborhood I was in seemed nice enough, and the streets were quiet in the early morning. I set out at around 6 a.m., thinking it would be a peaceful start to the day. The route that I chose was a loop through a park and some quiet streets nearby. The park was a bit secluded, with only a few early risers walking their dogs. I jogged along the path, enjoying the crisp air and the sound of leaves crunching under my feet. Everything felt normal until I made my way to the street section of my route. As I turned onto a side street, I noticed a man walking toward me. He looked disheveled, but I didn't think much of it. I gave him a polite nod and continued jogging. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced back and saw the same man had turned around and was walking quickly in my direction. Before I could react, he was right beside me. I slowed down, feeling uneasy. He said hello, his voice gruff. I was about to say something when he suddenly grabbed my arm. His grip was firm, and I felt a rush of panic. "Give me your stuff," he demanded. I tried to pull away, but he was stronger than I expected. I saw a small knife in his hand, barely visible, but enough to make me realize that he wasn't playing around. I was on a jog, so the only thing of importance that I had was my fitness watch, which I handed to him. He backed away slowly, still watching me closely. "Just stay there," he said before turning and running off down the street. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't call the police until I jogged back home, and I gave them a description over the phone of the guy and where it all happened. I couldn't help but think about how close I had come to something much worse. The knife had been so close, and I wondered what might have happened if I had resisted. I lost my watch, which sucked, but I was thankful that I hadn't been hurt. What didn't make much sense to me was that the guy tried to rob me while I was on a run. He couldn't have thought that he was getting much stuff from the robbery. In the end, I never found out what happened to the man, or if he was caught. It was scary how it happened so quickly and escalated to a dangerous level over a watch at 6 a.m. in the morning.